What if events went differently in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2002? What if Peter Parker, Mary Jane, and Harry Osborn were bitten by the spider? What do you think would happen? Welcome back, my fellow watchers of the multiverse, to a brand new Marvel's What If episode, where we finally come full circle. Peter Parker, Mary Jane, and Harry Osborn all being Spider-Man in one universe. Imagine 3 spider people running around New York City. This would be absolutely insane, and I cannot thank you enough for requesting this Marvel's What If, because I was so happy to write this after What If Peter Parker and Harry Osborn got bit by the spider, and now doing What If Peter Parker, Mary Jane, and Harry Osborn got bit by the spider is going to be so interesting and such a complex narrative. Now, I do want to say thank you so much again, but that being said, my fellow watchers of the multiverse, are you ready to dive into this What If? Let's get into this. Peter, Harry, and Mary Jane in this reality are all bitten by the spider. This does not happen in the reality that we all know, but in the vast realities, anything is possible. This particular incident happens because of a practically excited Flash Thompson. Location: Genetics Laboratory. Peter and Harry were quite excited for this trip. Peter was still starstruck from seeing Harry's father, Norman Osborn, who had dropped Harry off at the location of the school's trip personally. Even though Harry was nice to him, Peter knew that he was not in his class. Harry was leagues ahead of him. Sometimes Peter wondered why Harry even tagged with him, and he hoped that it was not because of the fact that he helped him academically with assignments and projects. Suddenly, Peter's mind completely went blank when he saw her. Unfortunately, Harry had already seen her before Peter, and there was this annoying smirk on his face. The girl was Mary Jane Watson, and she was Peter's crush since he was 6 years old. Peter had not been able to approach her and communicate with her, and Harry knew. As a good friend, Harry capitalized on this fact to tease Peter, and the latter blushed sheepily every time. "Come on, Peter, just go and talk to her," Harry teased him. Peter just smiled shyly and said that he did not feel like it today. This prompted laughter from Harry, who knew the drill, as Peter did not always feel like talking to Mary Jane. However, something strange happened. Mary Jane started walking towards them, and Peter was stunned. He was not sure at first, as he thought that she wanted to meet some other person, but now he wasn't quite sure. Mary Jane's gaze was straight towards him. Peter's heart started beating so rapidly that he thought that he might have a seizure. Within moments, Mary Jane was at his front. "You're Peter Parker, right?" Mary Jane asked him, and he was lost for words. Peter started stuttering, but fortunately, Harry stepped in front of him. Harry answered in the affirmative for Peter, and he heaved a deep breath. Mary Jane looked at Peter funny and stated that she wanted to talk to Harry concerning something important. She politely asked that Peter should excuse them. This shattered Peter's heart to pieces, and he quickly muttered something and left. "Your friend is very funny," Mary Jane told Harry, and she immediately got into why she wanted to meet him. Mary Jane's purpose was to ask Harry whether there was any vicinity at Oscorp. Things were not looking good for MJ, as her abusive and drunken father had intensified his hostility. MJ wanted to start earning in order to secure her future quickly. Even though she wanted to be an actress, when she saw Harry's father, she figured that she could get a side job as an intern. At least she would get some money out of it. Harry was her ticket into getting the job, and this was why she was wanting to meet him. MJ quickly told Harry about her intentions, and he stated that it was no problem. Harry told her that he would let his father know about it. He just asked her to send her details to him, and he would do the rest. This shocked Mary Jane, as she did not expect it to be too easy. What shocked her more was when Harry requested that she stay with him during the tour at the laboratory. Mary Jane figured that she might as well stay and chat with him, as it did not pose any harm. What MJ did not think about, however, was the insecurity of Flash Thompson, her boyfriend. Location, school, trip. As they talked, Peter watched from afar, and he felt some pangs of jealousy as MJ laughed and joked around with Harry. However, Peter was not the only one that was annoyed by their meeting together. Flash Thompson had mixed feelings when he saw Mary Jane and Harry together. He knew that Harry was stinking rich, and he was a good-looking guy, and the idea of him stealing MJ, his girlfriend, was very visible. Feeling of insecurity started entering into Flash's mind, and it escalated when they visited the genetic spiders. Flash saw MJ lean towards Harry, and the look she gave him made him very mad. Flash quickly started approaching Harry, but Peter noticed it and moved to stop him. Flash quickly held Peter by his shirt and threw him towards the spiders. Mary Jane, out of reflex, moved to stop Peter from hitting the glass, and the two of them smashed into it. Harry looked at the two of them, dumbfounded, but Flash was still approaching him. Fortunately, Flash was stopped by the security guards before he reached him, even though Harry had already dashed to a safe distance. Unknowingly to Harry and everyone, a genetic spider had escaped from its cage, and it was slowly descending to its target, Harry. The spider descended to Harry's hand, and it immediately bit him. When it did, it immediately sent a jolt of pain to Harry's body, and he swatted the spider aside as he still looked on at Peter and MJ, who had spiders crawling all over them. Instantly, they stood up and brushed the spiders off their bodies. The staff of the genetic labs rushed to them quickly. They asked if they were bitten, but Peter looked at MJ and they quickly came to an agreement. They told the lab attendants that they were not bitten. Both Peter and MJ figured that they might be quarantined if they acknowledged the fact that they were actually bitten by the spiders. MJ stylishly used her hair to cover the spider's bite on her neck, while Peter pulled his shirt down to conceal his. After the lab attendants had checked them for any glass injuries, and the spiders were accounted for, as the spider that escaped back to its cage, they let them go. Flash Thompson was in huge trouble, as the school had already contacted his parents for his misbehavior, but Peter and Mary Jane knew that they were in much more trouble because they had been bitten by the genetically altered spiders. They did not know what might happen to them, and they were scared. Harry was probably more scared than both of them because he was bitten too, and he had no one to confine him. He had seen when the spider bit both Mary Jane and Peter, but he did not want to inform them of his predicament. Harry simply brushed off the worry because he remembered that his dad was Norman Osborn, the CEO of Oscorp Facilities. Whatever happened, his dad would find a way to cure him. With the assurance, Harry had peace of mind. In his mind, he was better off than Peter and MJ. Location, Oscorp Facility. After Norman Osborn had dropped off his son, he went straight to his company. Norman was the CEO of Oscorp Facilities, and he had a potential crisis on his hands. Today, Norman was meeting with the representative of the military, and he had to seal the deal or his company would lose the military contract. Norman already had intel that Quest Aerospace was already lying in wait to snatch the contract from them. This situation was practically tricky because Norman had not been able to accomplish the task of the military. They wanted super soldiers, but Norman needed more time to perfect the serum. Norman quickly cleared his mind of all doubts, as he reminded himself of who he was. He was the CEO of Oscorp Facilities, and he had done that through his blood, sweat, and wits. Norman had been in difficult situations like this one before, and had gotten out of them too. He quickly motivated himself as he kept on a smile before he went to meet the military's representative. "I got this," Norman muttered under his breath as he walked into the room. It appeared that Norman did not get anything. The military's representative was very rude and unfair in Norman's judgment. Norman had asked for more time to perfect the serum, as it was almost ready, but the general was having none of it. He quickly and rudely told Norman that aerospace had already developed super soldier robots, and that the project was better for the military. He told Norman that the robots meant that the American army would have more firepower without the risk of losing any lives. With that, he told Norman that his services would no longer be needed, and he rudely dismissed him and walked out of him. Norman was boiling inside because of the humiliation and embarrassment, but all he could do was harden his smile as he squeezed his fists together. Norman wished he could beat the general to a pulp, there and then, but all he could do was put on a fake and heavily aggravated smile, while the military's representatives left. Once they had exited, Norman immediately went into his office. In his office, he unleashed his anger. Norman thrashed his office because of the amount of frustration that was in him. He needed the contract for Oscorp's survival. Norman knew that the board members would not hesitate to out him as the CEO if they discovered that the military had withdrawn their contract. Norman's mind started working on how to get the contract back, and his mind fell on a ridiculous, dangerous idea. Norman immediately brushed the idea off, but after thinking of some more minutes and coming up with nothing, he went back to the idea again because of his desperation. The idea for Norman to test the super soldier serum on a human being, and if it worked, he would display the person to the military and get back the contract. This idea was dangerous because the serum was still in its experimental stage, and not yet cleared for human testing. The other problem was that nobody in his right mind would agree to be experimented on with the serum. This was when Norman's sick plan came into play. He wanted to inject the serum on himself. Getting a human test subject would take time, and Norman did not have it. He decided that he would just test the serum on himself and then display it to the military. Once the experiment worked, then he would surely get back the contract. What if it does not work? A part of Norman's mind told him, but he completely ignored it. Nothing could possibly go wrong, he told himself, as he already went on the move to inject the serum into him. Location: Oscorp Facilities. Norman had made sure that he had privacy before he started the process. He had a lab attendant with him, and that was all he needed. Norman did not want to draw publicity to his daredevil act. Norman noticed that the attendant was reluctant to carry out the task, and he was annoyed. Even though Norman knew that what he was asking for was a huge task, he did not appreciate his employee delaying. This was because Norman did not also want to lose his guts. He ordered his employee to proceed, and he did. Norman was injected with the serum, and he went into a hellish pain. Norman felt the pain that he had never felt before, as his body was going through the huge transformations. His whole body and mind threatened to shatter, and then suddenly, he blackened out. Norman was gone. In his place was the Green Goblin. The pod used for the experiment exploded, and it blasted the attendant backwards. When he stood up again to check up on Norman, the Green Goblin was already waiting for him. The Goblin held his neck and lifted him up as he squeezed. He held him in this position until he ran out of breath, and he died. Once the Goblin was sure that he was dead, he disposed of the body. He had a new target in mind, and it was Quest Aerospace. He would destroy them, and then the military would have no other option than to come back to him. Norman immediately went and put on the super soldier armor that was being produced by Oscorp Facilities. This is what he would use to destroy his competition. Immediately he wore the goblin suit. He jumped on the glider that was controlled by the suit, and he flew off to wreak havoc. The entire atmosphere was filled with his cackle. Location, quest, aerospace. The military representative was sure that he had made the right choice in ditching Oscorp Facilities for aerospace. When he saw what they had to offer, he had first thought that they were bluffing, but now he knew that the military was onto something huge. He decided that the military's funding and contract would pass to them immediately, but he did not live to do it. Suddenly, there was a strange cackle, and everyone was confused. The military's representative, though, was still part of the drills that Quest Aerospace had set up, but they looked as confused as he was. Immediately, a window in the facility shattered, and a demonic figure emerged, flying on a glider. Once the creature was sighted, a high-pitched scream came out of one of the soldiers' mouth. If the circumstances were different, the general would have had the soldier disciplined there. But this was way different. Even the military representative was white with fright at the sight of the creature. It was when one of the Quest Aerospace workers started running for his life, and they were broken out of their fear trance. They made an attempt to run into the building, but it was futile. The Green Goblin immediately came down and destroyed the facility with pumpkin bombs. Within seconds, he had eradicated all of them, and he felt only amusement at their deaths. This fact was evident in his constant cackle. After he had examined his work, the Green Goblin then flew away on his glider. Location: the Parker residence. Peter had woken up from his sleep, but something seemed off. He felt weird, and he didn't know the reason for it. Peter then ran his mind through the events of yesterday. He remembered the spider bite, and it sent a shiver through his spine. Peter had started feeling feverish when he came back from the trip, and he was actually scared. He had even acted sort of rudely to Uncle Ben last night, as his head was banging. Peter had just crashed into his bed and passed out. Now he was scared that the bite had changed anything in him. Peter quickly rushed to his mirror to examine himself. When he examined himself, he discovered that nothing had gone wrong with his physique. Instead, everything had gone right. Peter Parker was now more muscular and chiseled, and he was surprised. The transformation, though, it was nothing that obvious, very evident. Peter was so shocked that he slapped himself, but he quickly regretted it immediately. His brain sent out the action. The slap would result in his glasses being fractured, and Peter waited for it, but nothing happened. Peter opened his eyes and discovered that he was not wearing his glasses, and this blew his mind. Parker had developed perfect eyesight overnight. In excitement, Peter jumped up in joy, but the results of this was simply unbelievable. Peter jumped from the floor of his room, and he landed on the ceiling, being stuck there. This caused a scream to escape his lips, and it alerted Uncle Ben and Aunt May. As they were about to rush to Peter's room just across the road, at Mary Jane's house, her stepfather was blasted out of the window, and he landed on his back unconscious in front of Uncle Ben's apartment. From the whole of their house, a very surprised Mary Jane could be seen. Location: high school. Peter had seen the state of Mary Jane's stepdad, and his smart brain had quickly figured out everything. Mary Jane had also gotten powers. Now, Peter was on his way to her table at the cafeteria. It was lunchtime, and Peter decided that he had to make the first move because they had to stick together now. As Peter walked towards Mary Jane's table, he was physically trembling, and he tightened his hand on his tray, to the extent that it actually made a dent. Peter cursed Harry for not being around at school, because now he had no support. Peter reached her table and was about to tap her when Flash arrived. Flash immediately sat down beside MJ and gave her a peck on her cheek. Peter saw this and flushed. He immediately set himself to turn away and flee, but Flash had already caught sight of him. Flash's demeanor immediately soared as he recalled that he still had unfinished business with Parker. He rudely called him out and asked him about his friend, Harry. Peter politely told him that Harry was unavailable, but Flash was having none of it. Flash informed Peter that because of the little incident at the tour, his parents had been heavily billed. "I know I can't get the money from you because you're already poor," Flash told Peter, and his statement drew laughter from the onlookers who were greatly multiplying by the minute. Flash stated that he planned to obtain the money from Harry, but since he was not around, he would have to take out his rage on Peter for the time being. Mary Jane immediately stood up and told Flash to quit what he was doing, but Flash was having none of it. Flash moved his hand to push her aside, but with greatly surprising reflexes and strength, Mary Jane caught his hand. Flash tried to remove his hand from her grasp, but he couldn't. For a moment, the emotion of fear started creeping up to his eyes, but it was all gone in an instant when Mary Jane released his hand. Flash did not think much of it, and he told her to mind her own business. He blamed everything on her by stating that she was the one that made him jealous by hanging out with Harry when she knew his insecurities. Peter was just analyzing everything, and he knew that he was in trouble. Flash signaled to his men to surround Peter, even as he continued to massage the spot that MJ held him. There was no time, and they had to beat up Peter before any of the teachers were alerted. Flash signaled to one of his friends to rush Peter from the back. This was because they wanted to take him unaware. However, it was Peter that took them unaware. As the person rushed him from the back, Peter had a strange feeling that something bad was about to happen to him, and he acted based on instinct. Peter immediately sidestepped and tripped the attacker, who fell face first before Flash. The expression on Flash's face was ridiculous, but he quickly recovered and signaled to everyone to attack Peter together. They set off events that took place next. This set off events that took place next that was unexplainable by who witnessed it. Even Peter did not know what happened. In a flurry of moves, Peter Parker thwarted the efforts of Flash Thompson and his friends. In a couple of seconds, they were all on the floor groaning, while Peter stood tall on top of Mary Jane's table. It was at that exact moment that the school's principal came rushing in, and Peter knew that he was busted. Location: Osbornes Mansion. Harry had felt feverish the night before, but today he felt stronger than usual. He had completely forgotten about the spider's bite. Harry first knew that something was wrong when his hand could not let go of the sink. When he washed his face immediately, he applied force to rip his strangely glued hand. The sink broke apart from the wall. This left Harry frozen in shock. 1,000 thoughts were running through his mind, but he could not focus on one. Immediately, his hand chose that moment to let go of the sink, and it fell in the direction of his leg. With the speed of reflex that Harry knew he did not have in him, he immediately removed his leg and landed on the wall of his bathroom. What made the situation strange was that Harry was actually sticking like a spider. It was this comparison that made Harry remember the bite, and everything made sense to him. The bite from the spider had given him powers. Harry's mind then immediately went to Peter and Mary Jane. He guessed that they must have gotten powers too, as they were bitten by the genetic spiders. Harry decided that he needed to hide his powers under wraps. In order to do this, Harry decided that he would not go to school today. He called in sick, and he informed his butler Bernard that he would not be able to go to school today because he caught a cold. Bernard did the right thing, and he called his father concerning Harry's health. Norman was shocked by the news, and he decided that he would check in on Harry later in the day, as he had things to do. Harry, on the other hand, used his free time to practice and flex his newly given powers around his room. He did this by crawling around his walls and performing numerous flips that he knew he could not have accomplished in the earlier days. Location: the principal's office. Peter knew that he was in big trouble when he saw Uncle Ben's car pull up in the school's parking lot. He had feared that he would only get detention, but now he prayed for it, as he did not want Uncle Ben to be disappointed with him. Uncle Ben paid him no mind while they were inside the principal's office. The look on his face was that of shame with a little bit of surprise, as he did not think that Peter could do a thing like this. It was not only when Peter confirmed that he really did the act that Uncle Ben actually believed the principal's story. The little glimmer of hope that was in his eyes, that was just a big misunderstanding, fizzled out, and huge disappointment took its place. After the meeting on their way to the parking lot, Uncle Ben asked Peter to tell him the exact details of what took place, and Peter did, even though everything was now a blur to him. Uncle Ben shook his head and asked Peter why he did it. Peter told Ben that it was simply self-defense, but he did not think so. Uncle Ben told him that he was utterly disappointed in him, but Peter did not need to be told that to know. As they passed the school hallways on their way out, Mary Jane approached Peter and asked for a word with him. As surprised, Parker looked at Uncle Ben for his permission, and he reluctantly allowed him to. Once Uncle Ben went out of earshot, MJ came straight at Peter and asked him if he too had gotten powers, and he nodded. Peter told her that he knew that she had gotten her powers after the incident at her house, as Uncle Ben had briefed him before he left the school. Mary Jane asked Peter for the way forward, but he was also lost. "You know what? Come over to my house, and we would discuss everything better," Mary Jane said, but Peter did not hear her the first time. Peter asked her to repeat what she said again, and she did, much to Peter's disbelief. He heard her the first time, but his brain did not want to believe the information it got because it was too good to be true. Peter, while stuttering, accepted the invitation, and MJ looked at him funny. She told him that he was a very amusing fellow, and departed. While Peter looked on, when MJ left, it seemed like she left with Peter's sense of hearing, because Uncle Ben had to go and tap him after multiple attempts of shouting to get his attention. Uncle Ben quickly asked Peter if she was the reason for the fight, and he quickly denied it, but the old man already knew the answer. He told Peter to be careful about her, that something does not seem right about her, especially after the incident in the morning. Peter almost laughed out loud at Uncle Ben. If only his uncle knew that he and MJ had shared the same fate. Location: Osbornes Mansion. Norman was in a crisis and he did not know what to do about it. The events of the previous day were still a blur to him. The last thing Norman remembered was the immense pain he had before he blacked out during the experiment. After that, he had woken up at his study, but he received shocking news that the people at Quest Aerospace were attacked by a strange demonic-looking entity, and none of them made it out alive. Even the military representative was killed. Norman was totally shocked at the news, even though, strangely, a part of him was not surprised. It was as if a part of him already knew about the incident, as if a part of him was at the incident, and as if he was the one that caused the incident. Immediately, Norman thought of this. A sharp pain passed through his head, and he quickly stopped thinking about the whole incident altogether. Norman decided to focus on the events he had planned out for today and move on. He had woken up early and left the house to go to work, only for Bernard to call him. Norman was pretty surprised, as Bernard hardly called him for anything. This was because Norman had placed enough power in him to handle everything concerning the household, as he knew that Bernard was very capable. So when Norman saw Bernard calling, he knew that it would be something serious, and it was. Bernard told Norman that Harry was sick, so sick that he wanted to skip school. This greatly shocked Norman because Harry rarely fell sick, but when he did, it was always a distress. Norman ordered Bernard to provide Harry with everything he wanted, and that he would check in on him later, and also told Bernard to take Harry to the hospital for the doctors to run tests immediately and give him a diagnosis. Bernard responded that he would carry everything out, and hung up. Leaving a very worried Norman, he decided that he would check up on Harry once he got back home. As he decided to do this, he realized painfully that the two of them have not been spending much time together again. Norman wanted to blame it on his work, but he couldn't. He knew that he should not make any excuses for himself. He decided there and then that he would change the narrative and become closer to his son. Because when it came down to it, Norman sadly realized that no one knew when they would be leaving this earth. Norman shivered when his thought passed through his mind, as he remembered the incident at Quest Aerospace Facilities. Location, MJ's apartment. Mary Jane had invited Parker over, but now, she wished that she didn't. They had just spent what seemed like an eternity in awkward silence. She would have been creeped out if it was another person, but for some reason Peter seemed to amuse her in a good way. MJ then finally decided to break the ice. She asked Peter about the powers that they had acquired, and the question seemed to loosen him up a whole lot. It was as if the question was triggering for Peter to fire everything as he went on and on about the things he discovered he could do. MJ listened in awe as he discovered that Peter was actually smart and cute when he talked. They then discovered that they had the same powers: the super strength, speed, reflexes, wall crawling, and what Peter called the spider sense. Mary Jane knew exactly what Peter was talking about when he said the word spider sense, because it actually seemed to her this morning. Peter described the sense as an emergency alert for danger, and MJ could not agree more. She told Peter that she experienced it this morning. Peter's interest was then piqued, and he asked her about the incident with her stepfather in the morning. MJ's expression then became very guarded suddenly. Peter got the hint, and he immediately apologized. He told Mary Jane that if it was okay if she did not trust him yet. Mary Jane then analyzed the situation and figured that Peter was actually the only one she had now. She then decided to narrate the whole situation to him. Location, rooftop of a random building. Mary Jane had promised herself not to cry, but she did. She had buried out her soul to Peter. She told Peter about how emotional and sometimes physically abusive her stepfather had been to her and her mother. When Peter asked her why they did not just dump him and leave, she broke down in tears because she knew that it was not that easy. Her mother was not strong enough. Mary Jane explained that her stepfather wanted to get physical with her mother in the morning, and by instincts, she interfered. Mary Jane said that she never knew the little shove she gave him would have blasted him through the wall of their house. Currently, her mom was blaming everything on her, and it broke her. When Peter asked MJ about the whereabouts of her mom, she stated that she was at the hospital seated at the bedside of her abusive husband. Peter then smiled and said that it was perfect. This statement really confused MJ, and Peter quickly explained that he had kept something away from her. He told her that they had another super cool power. Mary Jane was surprised and demanded that Peter tell her. Peter laughed and said that he'd rather show her than tell her. After this, Peter had carried her to the top of the story building. This frightened MJ, but he told her not to be scared. Peter told her to watch carefully, and she did. Mary Jane watched how Peter ran up the edge of the building and leaped off of it. Mary Jane screamed her heart out, even as he expected the sickening thud that never came. When Mary Jane found the courage to look, she found Peter swinging from a white thread, which awfully resembled a web. When Peter swung back to her, she discovered that the web came from his hand. This freaked Mary Jane out, as it was sort of gross, but Peter told her that it was also one of her powers. This made Mary Jane ask a question that was suddenly disturbing her. She asked if the web came out of any other places aside from the hands, and Peter told her that it did. Mary Jane's face had an expression of the utmost fear and shock. It was too much for Peter to bear, and he bursted out in spontaneous laughter. The laughter was too much that he had to double over wheezing. Peter then revealed to her that he was lying. This led to a playful punch by Mary Jane to Peter. Peter, amidst the laughs, apologized again, but he stated that he could not just resist. After some moments, Peter finally caught his breath, and he told Mary Jane to try the swinging out. MJ immediately refused for obvious reasons. Peter, however, cleared her doubts. He stated that she just needed a leap of faith, that everything would come naturally. Mary Jane found it very hard to believe him, but she saw the truth in Peter's eyes. Mary Jane figured that Peter could not possibly do anything to harm her. Peter also stated that the swinging process had a way of clearing the mind, and MJ decided to give it a try. What could possibly go wrong, she asked herself, even as her mind flooded her with numerous thoughts of things that could actually go wrong. However, Peter gave her his word to catch her if anything did go wrong. Peter told her to just leap off the building and everything would come to her. And MJ heeded his words after an eternity of staring down the edge of the building. MJ leaped off with a yell, and she found herself plummeting to the ground rapidly. Peter was on standby, and he was about to dive and get her, as he was feeling very worried. But then it happened. Mary Jane shot a web out of her wrist, and it glued to a building. After this, she used the momentum to swing towards the building and leap into the air. Mary Jane repeated the action several times, and the expression on her face was pure joy and ecstatic. This was because she was having the time of her life. Peter watched her go, and his admiration for her went up as well. Because of this, Peter let down his guard and relaxed as she seemed to have gotten a hang of it. Mary Jane was swinging towards Peter now, but suddenly the face of her stepdad appeared in her mind, and with it came the malicious words he had said to her. The image of her mother's disappointment face appeared in her mind, and Mary Jane was suddenly distracted. MJ lost her focus, and she decided to stop the swinging at once. This time, however, when Mary Jane stretched out her hand to shoot a web, nothing came out. Suddenly, intense fear creeped into her, but it was not as fast as the floor that was rushing up to meet her. Mary Jane screamed for Peter to help, but he was frozen to the spot by the sheer terror. Peter could only watch as MJ fell to the ground and landed with a sickening thud. Fortunately, there was a car to cushion the fall, but the damages were still much. Peter was still paralyzed by fear, and the only time he recovered and fled was when the crowd that had started gathering around MJ began pointing up the story building at him. Peter quickly fled the scene by jumping the rooftops with tears in his eyes. He did not think that he would be able to forgive himself because he had just killed Mary Jane. The sheer realization of the fact almost drove him mad. It took everything in Peter to keep moving towards his house, then to just pause and die from the overwhelming guilt. Location: hospital. Mary Jane had never been in so much pain before. Immediately, she landed on the car. She felt tremendous pain like never before. She literally felt her bones breaking and her muscles ripping apart. The only grace she had was the pain made her pass out instantly. Mary Jane's consciousness slipped in and out. She woke up and saw herself in an ambulance. Then she passed out again. The next glimpse, she was seeing herself being rolled by surgeons to the theater, and her mother holding her hand weeping. After that, she did not wake up again for a long time. Peter had gone to the hospital to see her as he could not deal with the guilt that was eating away at him. When he went there, he experienced a little difficulty with the front desk, but luckily Mary Jane's mother was passing through. Peter quickly stopped her and he introduced himself to her as Mary Jane's classmate and her neighbor. Her eyes looked weirdly and sunken in because of the amount of tears he had cried, and it looked like she had a hard time processing the information Peter just told her. When Peter saw this, he repeated himself, and finally recognition came upon her face. She asked him if he was the weird kid that stayed with Aunt May, and he hastily nodded. She then told the nurse on duty that he was with her, and they finally let him in. While they were working to Mary Jane's ward, Peter found the courage, and he started questioning her about the welfare of Mary Jane. It was as if the question was just the trigger she needed, as a flood of tears started escaping her eyes. She narrated the whole tale of Peter, as she was just looking for someone to unburden everything to. She told Peter that Mary Jane was in a critical state, and she was so scared. She talked about how they had 2 tragedies on their hands now. There was the incident of her husband, and now Mary Jane. She questioned the reason of Mary Jane going up the building in the first place, and Peter felt a pang of guilt in his heart. Mary Jane's mother quickly turned at him and asked him, accusingly, if he was the one responsible for Mary Jane going to the roof and subsequently falling, but Peter quickly denied it. MJ's mother's face had quickly changed from being sorrowful to being vengeful, and Peter was absolutely terrified. After she had eyed Peter suspiciously for some moments, she quickly apologized and said that the stress and events were getting her paranoid. She, however, stated that eyewitnesses had said a boy was at the top of a building when Mary Jane fell. Peter denied again and told her that he was not the one. She quickly accepted his statement and continued laminating to him. She stated that her mind was now in disarray because the doctors had presented a medical bill to her, and there was nowhere she could get that kind of money. She stated that when the medical bill of her husband was present to her, she almost fainted, but now seeing Mary Jane's own, she just wanted to die. Peter quickly discouraged her from dying. He told and assured her that everything would be okay. They immediately entered Mary's ward, and Peter's guilt escalated when they saw the state of MJ. He almost wept his heart out at the sight of her, but he held himself together. They had put Mary Jane in the same ward as her stepdad, and he was currently awake now. He looked at Peter with scrutiny and asked his wife who he was. She immediately told him everything about Peter's identity, and MJ's stepdad wasted no time in asking him whether he was the person who had pushed Mary Jane off of the roof. Peter quickly denied it again. Somewhere in his subconsciousness, Peter remembered an old Bible tale of his namesake denying someone 3 times, and it added more to his guilt. He quickly informed them that he had somewhere to be, and he dashed out of Mary Jane's ward. Peter walked all the way from the hospital to his house without realizing it, because he was wallowing in self-guilt and pity. Location: Uncle Ben's house. Once Peter got home, he immediately went to his room, even though Uncle Ben tried to talk to him. This saddened Uncle Ben, and he confided in Aunt May that he and Peter had been drifting apart, and he hated it. Aunt May confronted him, and just stated that Peter would eventually come around. She told him that teenagers behave like that nowadays. Uncle Ben signed and said that he really hoped that it was teenager troubles and nothing more. Aunt May suggested that he had a personal time and conversation with Peter, and he quickly accepted the plan. The only problem now was going to get him alone. Aunt May advised that he should just wait, and the appointed time would come. After some moments, Peter came down and said that he wanted to go to the library, and Uncle Ben decided to seize the opportunity. Uncle Ben told Peter that he would drop him off at the library. Parker immediately started protesting, but Ben paid him no mind. He immediately got his keys and told Peter to wait for him in the car. Before Ben left, he gave Aunt May a wink, as their plan was working and he might finally get very close to Peter. Location: the library. The ride to Peter's library had been very tense and oddly quiet, as Peter was not a fan of Uncle Ben dropping him off. Uncle Ben just concentrated on the road till they reached the library. As Peter was about to storm out, Uncle Ben held him back. Uncle Ben started questioning him about his recent change in behavior, but Peter did not give him any answer. Uncle Ben told Peter that he was in his shoes once, and he knew how wild the teenage days could be. He, however, advised Peter to be more careful with his choices and decisions. Uncle Ben looked Peter in the eyes and told him, "With great power comes great responsibility." After that, he allowed Peter to go into the library. Uncle Ben looked on as Peter departed from him, and he sincerely hoped that he would have been able to get through to the kid. Location: wrestling hall. The only reason why Peter was not pleased with Uncle Ben taking him to the library was because he was not actually going there. After hearing about Mary Jane's hospital bill and seeing her physical state, Peter was heartbroken and he decided that he had to do something to redeem himself. This was why he was currently on his way to take on an opponent for a huge amount of cash. The wrestling promotion had promised him $3,000 if he could last at least 3 minutes with their champion, Bonesaw. Peter felt pretty nervous, but he was sure that he had the powers to pull it off. Peter had told the ring announcer to introduce him as the human spider, but instead, he called him Spider-Man. Peter was not pleased, but something about the name seemed right, and it pleased him. The bells rang, and Peter used his skills and powers to easily defeat Bonesaw to the surprise of the crowd. This was because Peter had just focused all of his pain, frustration, and anger into one punch, and it knocked out Bonesaw. Immediately after this, Peter went to the promoter to get his money, but he found the situation impossible. The wrestling promoter told him that he was supposed to last 3 minutes, but since he finished the match in less than 10 seconds, he would only give him $10. Peter was filled with so much rage that he almost wanted to kill the promoter, but instead he broke his desk in anger and left. As Peter was leaving, however, a robber stole some of the promoter's money and was running towards his way. The promoter shouted at Peter to stop that guy, but he just smiled coldly and let the robber escape. Peter knew that karma would catch up to the wrestling promoter for dumping him, but now he was glad to see it unfold before his own eyes. What Peter did not realize was that his actions had also sent bad karma against him. When Peter went out, he discovered that Uncle Ben had been shot, and he immediately died after seeing him. Uncle Ben's last words was Peter, and when he gave up his ghost, the chase was on. Peter was in a murderous rage, and he started chasing the criminal down. Peter jumped, swang from across the building rooftops in pursuit of the person who killed Uncle Ben. Peter did not trust himself to do anything rational when he caught the person, but he still pursued him, notwithstanding. Peter suddenly shot a web on the suspected person's tires, and it caused the car to go off of the road into an abandoned area. The criminal quickly ran out of the car, as he knew that he was chased by someone or something that was definitely not human. Still, in a calm and seething rage, Peter pursued the offender. Even when he entered into an abandoned story building, Peter gave a dark smile as he quickly climbed the building to catch up with the criminal. The criminal was terrified out of his mind as he entered the stark, dark building. He thought the worst had happened when the police cars pulled up and surrounded the building, but he was wrong. Suddenly, Peter bursted out of nowhere and started beating up the criminal. Peter only stopped when he saw the face of the criminal. Peter realized that it was the same criminal that had escaped from the wrestling promoter. This truth was more big than Peter could handle. Peter was shaken by this discovery, and he let the robber go, but unfortunately, a greater tragedy happened. The robber slipped and fell to his death, and Peter was still there, speechless and unfocused. It was when the police flashed lights on his face that he came to his senses. Peter quickly fled the scene, and it sadly reminded him of Mary Jane's incident. Peter ran to a distant place, and he cried his heart out, or what was left of it. Peter was now the one responsible for the death of Uncle Ben and the current condition of Mary Jane. Peter laid on the rooftop completely drained and without any purpose or comfort. He thought about ending it all, committing suicide, and closing his chapter. Immediately, Peter thought of this. He heard Uncle Ben's voice screaming and erupt no in his head. Peter heard Uncle Ben's last advice to him. With great power comes great responsibility. With this, Peter found a new purpose. He now had only Aunt May and Mary Jane, and they were his responsibility. Peter knew that now that he had great powers, he would do everything in them to provide for Aunt May and Mary Jane. Peter swung home and he delivered the sad news to Aunt May. They cried together and Peter knew that his life would never be the same again. He now had great responsibilities. Location: hospital. When Mary Jane woke up, her mother cried profusely over her. She told Mary Jane that the doctors had almost lost her, and it almost broke her. Mary Jane wept with her, as she felt bad for putting her mother in this state. Amidst tears, Mary Jane's mother questioned her reasonings for going to the building and leaping off. She questioned why Mary Jane wanted to leave her all alone, and why she wanted to do that. Mary Jane could not bear it anymore, and she wept without holding back. She told her mom that it was an accident, even as her mind went to Peter Parker with malice. Mary Jane assured her mother that she was not going to try it again. But suddenly a snicker came from the back of the room. It was her stepfather, and he had been sitting in the dark corner of the room. "I'm very sure that it would not happen again," he said with a sneer, and a shiver went up Mary Jane's spine. Mary Jane asked him what he meant by his statement, but he told her to ask her mother. Mary Jane looked at her mother, but she would not meet her eyes. The suspense was killing MJ, and she screamed at her mother to answer her, but the reply was just more tears. Her stepfather just chuckled darkly and accepted to tell her the information. He told her that the doctors had stated that it was a miracle that she was even alive because of the height of the fall. He told Mary Jane that she was supposed to be dead, but somehow she was alive, with a few consequences of her actions. Mary Jane stayed silent as her stepfather took his time in letting out the consequences of the accident. His next words shocked her completely, or what was left of her. "You will never ever be able to walk again," he said with a mock of sadness. Location: Harry's room. Harry was sleeping when Norman came home. Norman saw Harry and his heart skipped a beat, because he suddenly realized why he had put in so much hard work in the first place. It was to provide a better future for his son. Norman felt a pang of pain as he realized that he had drifted quite a distance from his son, his main motivation. Norman gently tiptoed to Harry's bed in a bid to not wake him up. Norman's efforts were, however, futile as Harry raised up his head when he sat down on the bed. Harry asked sleepily who it was, and Norman revealed himself. On seeing his son amidst the events that happened recently, Norman was struggling to control his emotions. Norman realized that anything could happen at any time, and the fact that he survived the experiment drove it home. Norman confessed that he knew he was not steady, and sometimes he was a bitchy parent, but he always loved him. Harry was in total shock, but he watched as Norman went on and on. When Norman was through, Harry's emotions were also at its peak. He decided that if he withheld the information about his new powers from his dad, the guilt would kill him. After Norman assured him that he would always be there for him no matter what, Harry decided to tell his dad. "Dad, there's something I have to tell you," Harry said, and Norman's interest was piqued. Harry then went into full details of how he got the powers, but he made sure not to include Peter and Mary Jane. This was because deep down Harry knew that his father loved Peter, and he did not want to share the attention and affection with him. Harry then decided that it would be best if he showed his father Norman if he still didn't believe him after he explained everything. Harry then jumped down from his bed and told his dad to watch him carefully. Harry then went on to do a somersault from the floor of his room to the ceiling, and he stuck there. Norman's mouth was agape with surprise. Then suddenly his eyes dilated in front of his teeth, and it spread wider. Within moments he released a cackle, and Harry's face was of that in confusion. Location: Peter's apartment. A lot of time had passed, but Uncle Ben's death was still fresh in Peter's mind. This was because every day Peter woke up, he heard the last advice that Uncle Ben gave him. With great power comes great responsibility. Currently, Peter was at the top of a building where Mary Jane had fallen down. He had developed a sort of magnetism of the location, so he came here to reflect on how far he had accomplished and what more still remained. Peter casted his mind back to the time period after Uncle Ben's death, and how much things had really changed. Peter had graduated school with Harry. MJ was still crippled, and because of this, she had suspended her studies. She was now in a wheelchair, and Peter had provided for both her and himself. Peter had started saving the city as a masked vigilante. He called himself Spider-Man, because of the announcer at the wrestling match called him that. It sounded nice, even though Mary Jane teased him about it. Things had gotten a whole lot better with Mary Jane. At first, Peter had been very scared that Mary Jane would tell on, but she did not. Mary Jane had just given him the silent treatment, but she started responding bit by bit to him again. This was because Peter was consistent. Peter did not stop coming over to help her and do chores for her. One day, Mary Jane had told him to stop, in tears. Mary Jane told him that he did not need to continue fending for her because he felt guilty. Peter had told her that he would never stop caring for her, but it made her cry more. Later that day, MJ had a confrontation with her alcoholic stepdad again. Since her accident, in her crippled state, he pushed her around quite literally. He had no regard for her, and he also made sick jokes about her condition. It got to the point that Mary Jane could not take it anymore, and she fired back. The unfortunate thing was that her stepfather was always fired up, because he was always drunk, as usual. He immediately wanted to get physical with her, but MJ stopped his hand, to his surprise. MJ then brought him to herself for a strong uppercut. The punch almost knocked some sense into her stepfather, as he still came back for another round. Mary Jane knew that she was crippled, but she still had her super strength and reflexes, so she thought that she could handle him. MJ was wrong, as her stepfather feinted a punch at her, and she swung her hand widely to fend him off. This then gave him an opening, and he toppled her wheelchair. This caused Mary Jane to scream out in pain. She started trying to crawl back to her feet, but her legs could not support her weight. Her drunken father watched with dark amusement. MJ cried out for her mother, but unfortunately she was nowhere to be found. Her drunken stepfather then moved in to beat her to a pulp, and she closed her eyes in anticipation. The sound of a punch came, but the impact and pain never did. When MJ opened her eyes again, her stepfather was lying sprawled on the ground, and Peter was standing over him. The look on Peter's face was murderous, but immediately he saw her. His expression softened. He immediately carried MJ to the wheelchair and lifted her to the house. MJ never went back home. The next day, the drunken stepfather and her mom relocated to an unknown place. Since that day, Mary Jane had become family. After that day, Peter had started his superhero business, but he never got serious until graduation. MJ became his eyes and ears, as she would monitor the crime radar and give him information. Peter had to quit his dream of being a photographer to work at Oscorp in order to provide the bills. Peter had moved out of Aunt May's apartment for a place of his own, and Mary Jane moved out with him. The place was not shabby at all, and Peter knew that it would not have been possible to afford a place like this if he had continued in his photography work. Whenever he thought about it, he figured it was proper he gave up the photographing part of his life, as he had caused Mary Jane to give up her acting too. The only issue was that Norman Osborn had started noticing that he had been turning up very late for work. Norman had threatened him with a suspension, and that had shocked Peter. What Peter needed was a balance in his life, and he didn't know how to do it. Sometimes Peter just wished that there was another Spider-Man that could take turns with him. As Peter continued reflecting on how far he had come, and how things were threatening to break completely, a buzz started in his ear. Suddenly, without warning, it magnified to Mary Jane's voice, and it jolted Peter out of his thoughts. Peter screamed at the sudden outburst, and as usual, a giggle escaped from Mary Jane's lips. She chimed in for sleeping on the job, but he claimed that he was not sleeping. MJ then went on to inform him of the anomaly that was happening at an Oscorp event. The Oscorp event, he was supposed to be at. Peter suddenly sprang up as he knew he was forgetting something. Oscorp had a funding-giving event at the World Festival and he was supposed to be there. Peter knew that his absence would not get any merit with Norman. This made him feel good in a way that the event was being disrupted by an anomaly, even though it increased his guilt. Peter quickly got to his feet and leaped off of the building, even as he wore his mask in midair, and shot webs to commence his swinging down to the location. Peter had gotten really good at the swinging thing, and within moments, he was in the location of the event. But things looked strange. It was not a normal robbery incident. Peter saw the Green Goblin, and another figure dressed in an all-goblin suit, wreaking havoc on the event. The funny thing was, this other goblin figure was also shooting webs from his hands, and Peter was dumbfounded. Location: World Festival. Since the event at his room, Harry's life had changed drastically. Harry had got to know a lot of things, but the most prominent was the fact that his father was not normal. Harry knew his father needed rapid medical attention for his mental health, but he did not know any hospitals that could hold him or cure him. Harry's father, Norman, was now controlled by the Green Goblin. The flashbacks of his experience with the Goblin at his room that night still gave him nightmares. It was as if he was talking and dealing with a new person entirely. The Green Goblin had turned him into a weapon by using the best of Oscorp's technology to create a suit for him. Harry had blasted in his spider suit, which allowed him the luxury of not swinging to where he wanted to go. He also had smoke bombs and claws embedded in his suit. The Green Goblin had taken him on a compulsory course to the best weapon. Those were the worst months of Harry's life. The Green Goblin had promised him power and control over all their enemies and over the world. During his lucid moments, Norman would apologize to Harry and ask that he do what the Goblin wanted, so that he would not get hurt. This was why Harry still stayed and persevered, because of the little glimmer of hope that his father was not entirely consumed by the Green Goblin. Everything went smoothly as hell, was until Spider-Man started saving civilians. Harry knew that it was Peter Parker, but when the Green Goblin asked him, he refused to divulge the information in order to protect his friend. The Green Goblin called Harry useless, as he stated that Spider-Man was much better than him. The Green Goblin told Harry that Spider-Man did not have the luxury that he did and the excessive training that he had received, but he was still better than him. The insult hit home because Harry was always jealous of Peter, but he still refused to divulge his identity. Harry still told the Green Goblin that he did not know Spider-Man's identity. After that, the Green Goblin did not disturb him anymore, but he never failed to harshly compare him to the extraordinary feats Spider-Man pulled off every day to save civilians. The Green Goblin stated that if he could extend an olive branch to Spider-Man, then their trip would be unstoppable. But Harry immediately kicked against it. He told the Green Goblin that he would train harder, and that he did, as even the Goblin started getting impressed with his feats. Things were finally starting to look good for Harry, until one day when Norman came back. Angry and frustrated, Harry knew that the Green Goblin would manifest anytime soon, and he was not wrong. Within seconds, Norman let out a cackle, and Harry knew the switch had happened. The Green Goblin told Harry that they were going to destroy all of the Oscorp board members at the World event, because they wanted to sell the company and make Norman resign. Harry immediately protested, but that earned him a black eye as the Green Goblin lashed out at him. Harry did not let out any scream of pain, because he was already used to worse beatings than this from the Green Goblin. After that, the Green Goblin told him the time and the venue of their mission, and Harry had to comply. What Harry did not think of was Spider-Man's presence, and it came as a huge surprise to him when he saw him there. The Green Goblin had already made short work of the board members, as he blasted all of them with pumpkin bombs. As the Green Goblin sighted Spider-Man, he cackled and he wanted to go meet him head-on. Harry immediately got between them and told the Green Goblin that he would take care of Spider-Man. The Goblin eyed him suspiciously and nodded as he went off to terrorize the other members of the public with his pumpkin bombs. Harry wanted to make the fight fast and quick in order not to get Peter too hurt. As Peter swung in, Harry threw a blade at Peter's web, and this made the web slinger crash into a pillar. Harry then came in fast and hard on him, as he threw a smoke bomb to Peter's head. It exploded and Peter inhaled the gas. The fight would now be very easy for Harry, as the gas would cause Peter to be very dizzy. Harry then made short work of Peter as he immediately knocked him out and carried him to safety. Harry then swung and flew back to Green Goblin in order not to arouse any suspicions. When the Green Goblin asked him for the whereabouts of Spider-Man, Harry simply lied and said that he had run off because he was outmatched. The Green Goblin looked at Harry intently for a few seconds, and then he flew off immediately. Harry heaved a sign of relief and followed suit. Location: Peter's apartment. Harry was currently in Peter's apartment, and he could not contain his guilt again. After he had murdered all those innocent people, he decided to come clean with Peter and Mary Jane. He told them everything. Harry told them that he knew about their powers all this while. He told them that he was the Green Spider, and the Goblin was Norman. He explained Norman's illness in the best way that he could. Peter was very furious that Harry had done all these evil acts, and most importantly, that he hid everything from them. Mary Jane calmed him down and stated that they now have to find a solution. Peter suggested that they go and confront Norman to stop what he's doing. Harry and Mary Jane told him that it was a bad idea, but Peter was having none of it. Mary Jane reminded him that he was still injured from his last battle with Harry, and this made the Green Spider turn red. Peter stated that it did not matter, he had to stop Norman, and he would do it now. Peter then suited up, and he swung away. Harry shrugged at Mary Jane and followed suit. Location: Peter's apartment. The confrontation with Norman had gone very bad in all aspects. Norman had guilt, and when the boys were least suspecting, he had fatally stabbed and wounded Harry. Now, he knew that Spider-Man was Peter, and Mary Jane knew that he would come for her. Mary Jane knew all these things because she heard all that transpired from the confrontation through the microphones installed in Peter's suit. Immediately, Harry was stabbed. The Green Goblin escaped, and Peter screamed at MJ to get out of the apartment and escape before he got to her, as if she needed any further warning, as MJ was rolling her wheelchair out of the apartment. After gathering some of her things, she suddenly heard a distant cackle, and chills went down her spine. She then closed the door and went back inside as she was ready to defend herself. Unfortunately, the Green Goblin had more up his sleeve. Cans of gas bombs immediately flew into the house through the windows, and they immediately started dispensing the sleeping gas. Within moments, Mary Jane was unconscious. Location: the hospital. Peter's whole world had collapsed before his very eyes. He was in Harry's ward looking over his unconscious friend, who had received a call that his Aunt May had been attacked by the Green Goblin. Peter suddenly jumped off his seat, and he only calmed down a bit, but when they assured him that her condition, although it was critical, was now stable. Peter thanked the caller and was about to head over to Aunt May at her local residence hospital when another call came in. Peter knew the caller immediately and he heard the cackle. What Peter did not know, however, was that he had Mary Jane, and it shocked him to his bone marrow when he heard her whimpering over the phone. The Green Goblin laughed and told Peter to meet at the Queensboro Bridge if he wanted Mary Jane to live. With that, he hung up, but Peter's heart was no longer hanging in his chest. Location: Queensboro Bridge. Peter immediately swung to the bridge, leaving a still unconscious Harry at the hospital. Immediately Peter got to the bridge, he saw that the Green Goblin was already expecting him. The Goblin had MJ in one hand, and the Roosevelt Island tramcar full of children held hostage on another hand. The Green Goblin told Peter that he had to make a choice. He wanted to show him that he cannot always save everyone. Peter appealed to him. He called out to Norman, but the Green Goblin laughed manically. "Norman is dead," he said. And with that, he released the children and Mary Jane at the same time. A surprising twist actually happened. Mary Jane twisted in midair and wrapped her legs around the Green Goblin as she landed punches on him. Mary Jane had gradually recovered the use of her legs. She attributed the healing process to the spider bite, and how it changed her genes. MJ guessed that the super healing was also part of their powers. MJ usually practiced moving around and crawling whenever Peter was away. Mary Jane had refused to tell Peter about the healing process because she wanted to surprise him. But now, she guessed that this was enough of a surprise. A surprised Peter was looking at her in amazement until he was reminded of the children, and he rushed to save them. Mary Jane, on the other hand, was giving the goblin a hard time. The goblin immediately moved to stab her, but she launched herself off of him. The two were fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Immediately, she did. The images of fear and terror crept into her mind. She remembered the face of her stepfather and the image of her falling in the incident. Mary Jane cried out in terror as she realized that she could not shoot webs from her wrist. She started swinging her arms in a mock, trying to attempt. The Green Goblin saw this and was strangely amused. He then extracted the blades from his glider and moved to impale Mary Jane. Peter Parker saw this and knew what Mary Jane was experiencing: fear. Unfortunately, he was too far from her, and he knew that if Mary Jane did not do anything, the Green Goblin would kill her. "It is all in your head, MJ. You're stronger than them," Peter shouted to her. Mary Jane then closed her eyes in meditation, even though her spider sense went haywire because the Green Goblin was approaching. At the brink of the blades piercing her, Mary Jane opened her eyes and shot a web to the back of the Green Goblin's glider. As she did a backflip, the result was that the Green Goblin was sent flying to the ground, while Mary Jane stood on top of his glider. MJ then saw the Green Goblin would fall to his death and decided to save him. She jumped off the glider as she dived to catch him and swung away. As she stretched her hand to catch him, her spider sense went crazy again, but she could not move out of place. MJ twisted and she saw that the Green Goblin had controlled his glider to follow her and impale her from behind. She saw her life flash before her eyes as the glider moved in for the kill. But in a flash, Peter dived in and pushed her out of the way. The glider then used the same speed and impaled a wide-eyed Green Goblin. The glider continued with the same speed until it crashed to the floor with a still impaled Norman. He was dead on impact. Peter and Mary Jane looked at the site of the collision with tears in their eyes, and all they could think about was Harry. Location: the hospital. The noise from the television set in. His ward woke Harry up. When he regained consciousness, it took his brain time to process the information that he was seeing. The news headline read, "The Green Goblin is dead." Once Harry saw this, he realized what had happened. Peter had killed his father. Harry's heart was broken to pieces. When the nurse came in 2 minutes later to check on him, Harry was nowhere to be found. And that is going to be it for part 1 of What If Peter Parker, Mary Jane, and Harry Osborn got bit by the spider. Now, what did you think of this crazy intense Marvel's What If fan fiction with Peter, MJ, and Harry? You know, things are finally happening, and it's gonna get very crazy in Spider-Man 2 because now we have a rift. Is Harry going to become a Spider-Man in this timeline? I do want to say I apologize for the thumbnail as it's a little bit, you know, Harry is Spider-Man in it, but we made some changes. I know a lot of people don't like seeing the same thing, and I thought, you know what? We're gonna give Harry in this timeline a little bit more in-depth characterization, and I really wanted to give him, you know, a little bit of the Goblin personality, I guess you would say. But again, I was very excited at doing this Marvel's What If, as a lot of people really wanted me to do this, and I do want to say we're actually going back to back on like 2 different other ones, because I'm doing What If Peter and Gwen got bit in TASM 1, and then we're doing What If MJ got bit by the spider, so it's gonna be very interesting to see where these characters go. But that being said, my fellow watchers, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn those notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a fantastic day. Peace out.